The village lay still beneath a sky glittering with stars. Families gathered around fires, their laughter soft and fading into the cool night. The sound of mortars grinding grain slowed, and the hum of distant voices dwindled as sleep began to blanket the village. Amina, hands weary from a long day of work, finished the last of her tasks. Her shoulders sagged with relief as she prepared for rest. The air turned sharp with silence. The faint sound of drumming echoed through the stillness, a rhythm that grew louder with every passing moment. It carried a pulse that seemed to vibrate within the earth itself, startling those still awake. Mothers pulled children closer, whispering for quiet. The drumming stopped, but in its place came the sound of feet, many feet, moving in unison, though no one could see who walked. Eyes turned toward a small hut near the edge of the village. The shadows danced against its walls, twisting and bending, in strange patterns. There was no fire inside, no light to create such shapes. Yet the shadows moved, sharp and rhythmic, as though answering the call of an unseen force. Murmurs filled the night, spreading like wildfire. The elders, gathered under the great tree, exchanged uneasy glances. Some spoke of the Shadow Walker, a name that sent chills through even the boldest hearts. A tale whispered for generations came alive in their minds. Was this a sign of the ancestors, or a curse brought upon the village? The debate raged in low voices, fear creeping into their words. The murmurs swelled into a chorus of uncertainty. A young boy pointed at the shadows, his voice trembling as he asked what they meant. An elder dismissed him with a wave, but his own eyes stayed fixed on the hut. The crowd grew restless. Some spoke in hushed tones, pleading for patience. Others argued, voices rising with anger and fear. "Banish her!" one cried. "This is a curse upon us all!" Inside the hut, the sound of the crowd woke Amina. Her heart pounded as she sat up, startled by the noise outside. She moved toward the door, pushing it open just enough to see the faces staring back at her. Fear, suspicion, accusation. Baba Duma, the oldest and wisest of the elders, stepped forward, his staff striking the ground to demand silence. The crowd obeyed, their attention fixed on him. His voice carried authority as he spoke of balance, of the need to protect the village from forces they did not understand, but his words carried little comfort. Amina stepped outside, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to explain, to deny any knowledge of the shadows. Her hands trembled, her words uncertain. The crowd grew louder, their fear turning into anger. Baba Duma raised his staff again, silencing them with a single motion. His gaze turned to Amina, steady but unyielding. He spoke of the need for answers, the responsibility to uncover the truth. His words carried weight, an ultimatum wrapped in wisdom. The shadows had to be understood, or the village could never be at peace. If she could not find the truth, she could not stay. The words hung in the air like a heavy mist. Amina felt the weight of every eye on her, the judgment pressing against her chest. She nodded, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. She would go. She would seek the truth. The crowd watched as she turned away, her steps slow but deliberate. With each step, the murmur of voices grew quieter until only the sound of her breathing remained. The path ahead was uncertain, and her heart was heavy, but she knew there was no turning back. The woman's voice was sharp, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. "You're no help at all," she said, her hands busy grinding grain. The girl flinched but said nothing. She scrubbed the clay pots with hurried strokes, her head bowed. Every chore she completed seemed to invite another scolding. "You eat the food, but what do you give back?" The girl stayed silent, swallowing, the lump in her throat. Later, by the riverbank, the boy spoke with excitement, his hands weaving shapes in the air. "One day I'll be a great storyteller. The elders will invite me to their gatherings, and people from far villages will come to hear my tales." He grinned, his eyes bright with dreams. The girl smiled faintly, though her mind was far away. "You'll see," he said. "Even you'll be in my stories." The boy's voice softened as he glanced at her shadow, which seemed darker and sharper than his own. "Have you ever heard of the Shadow Walker?" he asked. She shook her head, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say the Shadow Walker is someone chosen by the ancestors. Their shadow moves on. Its own, carrying warnings or bringing destruction." He paused, his face serious. "Some say it's a blessing. Others say it's a curse." She looked at him, her eyes wide with unease. "What if—" he began but stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind. It's just an old tale." But the words lingered, heavy and unsettling. That night, she lay on her mat, her thoughts restless. The boy's words echoed in her mind, each one louder than the last. She clasped her hands tightly, whispering a quiet prayer for peace. The air felt thick around her, pressing against her skin. Her breath caught as she noticed it, the shadow on the wall, stretching and twisting as if alive. Her heart raced. She willed it to stop, to stay still, but it moved again, pulling toward the forest outside. She clenched her fists, her fear growing, with every beat of her heart. The shadow mimicked her trembling hands, its movements sharp and deliberate. She shut her eyes tightly, hoping it would vanish when she opened them again. It didn't. The village stirred early the next day, whispers spreading quickly. The elders gathered under the great tree, their faces grim. The oldest among them raised his staff and called for silence. His voice carried authority as he spoke. "This cannot go unchallenged. If the shadows are truly tied to her, we must act. The ancestors demand answers." The girl stood before them, her hands shaking. "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her plea was met with murmurs of doubt and fear. The old man's gaze was steady. "You must go," he said. "Find the sacred mountain. The answers lie there. If you do not return with the truth, the village will not welcome you back." Her heart sank. The crowd murmured louder, their voices a mix of relief and uncertainty. As she turned to leave, the boy stepped forward, his face determined. "You won't go alone," he said. The old man nodded, his approval silent but clear, though boy. Girl and the boy prepared for the journey in silence. The villagers gathered to watch, their expressions unreadable. Some looked away, while others whispered quietly. The girl tightened the cloth bundle in her hands, her shadow trailing her every movement. As they walked away, the boy's voice broke the silence. "We'll find the answers. You'll see." The girl glanced back at the village one last time. Her steps were slow, each one heavier than the last. But she kept moving, the boy at her side, and the shadow stretching long behind them. The path ahead was unknown, but she knew there was no turning back. A figure emerged from the shadows, his voice smooth and welcoming. He claimed to know the sacred mountain well, speaking of secret paths and dangers only he could navigate. His words flowed like water, and the two travelers hesitated. His grin widened as he praised their courage for venturing into the unknown. "You'll need a guide," he said. "Without me, you'll be lost." They glanced at each other, unsure but desperate. The figure's words made sense, and his confidence was hard to ignore. He spoke of the mountain's hidden dangers, from treacherous terrain to spirits that would test their resolve. His tone was light, almost playful, but his knowledge was undeniable. He promised to lead them safely, weaving tales of past travelers who had failed without someone like him. His words eased their doubts, though his sly smile lingered like a shadow in the corner of their minds. As hunger gnawed at them, the figure pointed to a distant caravan. "There," he said, "food and supplies, but heavily guarded. Your shadows, they could help." The girl stiffened, unsure. He laughed softly, assuring her it was harmless. "A test of your abilities," he called it. Reluctantly, she let her shadows stretch forward, slipping past guards and snatching what they needed. The guards shouted in confusion, unable to see what had taken their goods. That night the girl sat quietly, her thoughts heavy with guilt. She had seen the fear in the guards' eyes, the panic as their supplies vanished. The boy spoke in hushed tones, questioning their guide's intentions. "Something feels wrong," he said. But she couldn't shake her uncertainty. The figure smiled, watching them with eyes that seemed to see too much. The forest loomed ahead, dense and alive with whispers. The air was thick, pressing against them as they moved forward. Voices seemed to call from every direction, each one faint but urgent. The girl's shadows moved uneasily, mirroring her, rising fear. The boy whispered words of courage, though his own voice trembled. Each step felt heavier, the forest testing their will to continue. The whispers grew louder, and shapes formed in the darkness. Shadows twisted and rose, taking on familiar forms. The girl froze as a shadow lashed toward her, only to be blocked by her own. Her shadows fought back, shielding her from the assault. The boy faced a different terror, shadows that left him isolated, surrounded by emptiness. He clenched his fists, his voice breaking as he fought against the fear of being alone. A soft glow appeared, and a figure stepped forward. The spirit elder spoke with a voice like wind through leaves, calm but firm. "Your shadows," the elder said, "are powerful, but they are tied to your heart. Let fear or anger guide you, and they will bring destruction. Master your emotions, and they will protect." The elder's words settled over them like a quiet storm, stirring thoughts they weren't ready to face. The light faded, and the elder was gone. The figure pressed them onward, his voice urging haste. The forest seemed endless, its whispers growing quieter but never silent. Each step tested their strength, their resolve. The girl held her shadows closer, her thoughts echoing the elder's warning. The boy stayed near, his eyes darting around, ready for the next challenge. The figure's smile grew sharper as he watched them struggle. His voice changed, colder now, as he spoke of his plans. He didn't care for their journey or their sacred mountain. He wanted the girl's shadows, their power, for himself. He laughed as their trust shattered, stepping closer with words that dripped with malice. With a word, he bound the girl's shadows, pulling them tight like chains. She gasped, powerless, as he gloated about his victory. He spoke of her parents, how they had tried and failed to stop him long ago. Their strength had been no match for him, and neither would hers. The boy's voice broke through the despair, calling out to her. He reminded her of her parents' courage, their love. She closed her eyes, her thoughts turning inward. Her shadows were hers, tied to her strength, not his. She took a deep breath, her resolve steadying. The chains around her shadows loosened, then shattered. She faced him, her shadows rising around her like a storm. He laughed, his own magic dark and heavy. Their powers collided, the air crackling with tension. The boy moved quickly, using his wits to distract the figure's minions, giving the girl an opening. Her shadows surged forward, overwhelming the figure's defenses. With a final burst of strength, she struck. The figure faltered, his grin fading as his power crumbled. He vanished into the shadows, defeated, his plans undone. The forest grew, quiet, the air lighter. The boy stood beside her, his relief clear in his voice. The girl's shadows returned to her side, steady and calm. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they felt ready. The girl's shadows moved, with purpose, no longer a source of fear but a part of her strength. The boy smiled, his confidence restored. Together, they stepped forward, the forest opening to reveal the mountain beyond. The summit stretched before them, a jagged edge against the darkened sky. The air felt heavy, alive with an energy that pressed against their skin. At the peak stood Nyoka, his presence commanding. Dark energy swirled around him, rising like smoke and crackling with power. He watched them approach, his smile sharp and unkind. The girl's breath came in quick bursts, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The boy's eyes darted between her and the figure ahead, his resolve firm but laced with fear. Nyoka raised his arms, and the sky answered. Lightning split the air, casting sharp light over the mountain. The dark force around him grew, taking shape as shadowy creatures with burning eyes. His voice rang out, mocking and filled with confidence. "This is the end," he declared, his tone thick with finality. He spoke of the power he would claim, the balance he would destroy. The girl's jaw tightened, and her shadows stirred, ready to rise against the storm. A glow broke through the chaos, soft but steady. The spirits of the ancestors emerged, their forms radiant and serene. They moved toward the girl, their voices calm but resolute. They told her the weight of the choice she faced. To destroy Nyoka with her shadows would mean losing herself to their power, becoming a force of destruction. To banish him without them would mean giving up her connection to the shadows forever. Her heart ached as she listened, the weight of both paths crushing her. Nyoka laughed, his voice cutting through the stillness. He taunted her indecision, daring her to act. The girl looked at the boy, his face tight with worry. She turned back to Nyoka, her resolve hardening. She chose neither fear nor surrender. Instead, she chose to fight. Her shadows surged forward, dark and furious, meeting Nyoka's dark force head-on. The ground beneath them shook as shadowy figures clashed, each strike lighting the summit with flashes of power. Nyoka's forces surrounded them, relentless and growing. The girl's shadows pushed back, but the tide seemed endless. The boy moved quickly, his voice sharp as he called out. He pointed to a ledge above, drawing the enemy's focus away. With quick steps, he created a diversion, buying her the moment she needed. She turned to Nyoka, her shadows wrapping around her like armor. His magic met hers, the collision fierce and blinding. Light and darkness swirled together, each struggling for dominance. His laughter echoed, but her focus remained steady. She felt her shadows pull at her, threatening to consume her. Memories of her parents filled her mind, their strength and love steadying her. She gritted her teeth, her will overpowering the chaos within her. In a final surge, she directed her shadows with precision, striking at Nyoka's core. His confidence wavered as the shadows encased him, their grip unrelenting. The spirits of the ancestors appeared again, their voices joining hers as they sealed him within the spirit realm. His cries faded, and the dark energy dissipated, leaving only silence. Her shadows returned to her, calm and steady. She stood tall, her body trembling, but her spirit unbroken. The ancestors approached once more, their gazes warm. They blessed her for her courage and wisdom, reminding her that power must be guided by heart and mind. She nodded, her heart resolute. The shadows were a part of her now, and she would wield them with care. The boy joined her, his smile bright despite the weariness in his eyes. Together, they gazed at the horizon, the dawn painting the sky with hues of hope. The mountain felt lighter, its weight lifted with Nyoka's fall. They turned and began their descent, their steps slow but purposeful. The path home was long, but the future felt brighter, their journey a tale to inspire generations to come. The descent was slow, each step heavy with exhaustion. The air felt lighter, but their hearts were burdened with uncertainty. The girl walked ahead, her shadow trailing close, steady now. The boy followed, his voice breaking the silence. "They will see what you've done," he said. "They'll understand." She glanced back, unsure, but nodded. The mountain grew smaller behind them, but its weight seemed to linger in their minds. The village came into view, and the boy's steps quickened. The people had gathered, their faces unreadable. Silence met the travelers as they approached, the crowd parting slowly. A few voices cheered, their joy sincere. Others whispered, their eyes darting to the girl's shadow. Doubt hung in the air, thick and unspoken. The elder stepped forward, his staff striking the ground with authority. He raised a hand, quieting the murmurs. His voice carried over the crowd, steady and strong. He spoke of courage, of a journey that had brought peace to the village. His gaze fell on the girl, his words clear. "The ancestors have chosen you," he said. "You are their protector." The people listened, but not all were convinced. The elders' words held weight, but fear lingered in their hearts. That night, a modest feast was held. Food was shared, and the boys' laughter echoed, trying to lift the mood. The girl sat quietly, her shadow dancing faintly behind her. She caught the glances, the whispers that didn't stop even as the drums began to play. The joy was guarded, the trust not yet earned. In the days that followed, the girl's actions spoke louder than words. A hut had fallen, its roof broken from the storm. Her shadow moved, lifting beams and weaving them together. The people watched, their doubt shifting to wonder. In the fields, the earth was hard and unyielding. Her shadow softened it, preparing the soil for planting. The whispers began to change, curiosity replacing fear. The boy sat with the children, his voice lively as he wove tales of the journey. He spoke of the shadows that protected and the mountain that tested. He told of bravery and choices, of the girl who had faced the dark and returned stronger. The children listened with wide eyes, their excitement spilling into the village. The story spread, planting seeds of respect and understanding. The girl walked through the village with quiet confidence. Her steps were firm, her head high. The people no longer avoided her, though their hesitation hadn't fully faded. She spoke gently, her words calm but resolute. She helped where she could, her shadows a silent partner. Each act built a bridge, her presence becoming a source of quiet strength. Late at night, she sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. Her shadow danced softly, its movement steady and calm. She thought of the mountain, of the spirits and their warnings. Her fingers brushed the earth as she whispered a promise. "I will use them wisely," she said, "for good, not harm." Her shadow stretched as though in agreement and settled quietly beside her. In time, the people began to see her differently. The whispers grew fewer, replaced by nods of respect and words of gratitude. The shadow that once brought fear now stood as a symbol of strength. The boys' stories became part of the village's history, told around fires and remembered by the young. The girl stood watch, her presence a quiet reassurance. Her shadows no longer felt like a burden. They were her story, a part of who she was. The stars shimmered above, their light soft and comforting. She sat by the fire, her shadows moving gently around her, no longer restless. The journey had left her weary, but her heart felt calm. The shadows flickered, their presence steady and quiet. She watched them for a long time, her thoughts tracing back over the path she had walked. Fear and mistrust had once followed her, like a second shadow. The villagers had turned away, their eyes filled with suspicion. She had believed herself cursed, burdened by something she could not control. But now, as the firelight danced, she saw the truth. Her powers had never been a curse. They were a gift, one that had tested her courage and demanded her wisdom. Every step of the journey had shaped her into the person she was now. Her hands rested on her knees, her breath steady. She thought of how accepting her shadows had changed her. They had become a part of her, not something to fear. Through them, she had found strength and purpose. The doubt and hesitation that once clouded her mind were gone. She was no longer the girl who cowered before whispers and accusations. She was something more, someone stronger. Her gaze shifted to the shadows as they curled gently near the fire. They had taught her much. Power alone was never enough. Strength, when guided by wisdom and kindness, could build bridges and heal wounds. Her shadows had protected her and others, but only because she had learned to master them with care. The fire crackled softly as an idea began to form. She would not keep her story hidden. There were others who needed to hear it, especially the young. They would learn that strength came from within, that bravery was not the absence of fear but the will to face it. She would show them that what made them different could also make them extraordinary. The boy's voice carried through the village that evening, weaving the story into a song. He spoke of a girl who faced darkness and emerged as a protector. His words painted pictures of the mountain, the spirits, and the courage that had bound them together. The children listened, their eyes wide with wonder. The tale spread, whispered from one home to another. Even the doubters began to nod as they heard it, their fear giving way to quiet respect. The night deepened, and a gentle breeze stirred the fire. She felt a warmth that was not from the flames, a presence that seemed to settle over her. It was quiet, like a whisper carried by the wind. The ancestors, watching from beyond, seemed to speak without words. They approved of her choices, of the path she had walked. She lowered her head, her heart filled with gratitude. Her gaze lifted to the horizon, where the land stretched wide and open. Her shadows moved lightly beside her, steady and sure. She imagined a future where the village no longer feared what was different. Her shadows, once seen as a threat, would protect the people and the land. They would stand as a reminder of unity, not division. The fire burned low, and she smiled faintly. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to the village, to the children, and to the future. The tale of the Shadow Walker would guide generations, teaching them that courage and acceptance could overcome fear. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, her shadows rose with her, ready to begin again.